There are moments when the world stops turning, when a single image shatters the illusion of safety we carry like armor through our daily lives. July 14th, 2019, began like any other summer Sunday in Utica, New York. Young people scrolled through their phones over breakfast. Parents watered gardens in the early morning light. The sky stretched endless and blue above the Mohawk Valley, promising nothing but ordinary hours ahead. But beneath that peaceful surface, something unspeakable was already in motion. Bianca Michelle Devins was 17 years old. She had strawberry blonde hair, a constellation of freckles across her nose, and dreams that stretched far beyond the small city where she'd grown up. She was an artist, a daughter, a presence that filled rooms with light. To thousands who followed her online, she was a voice of creativity in a digital wilderness. By nightfall, she would be gone. What followed wasn't just a tragedy. It was a violation that would ripple across continent, exposing the darkest corners of internet culture and forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about obsession, image, and the dangerous spaces where fantasy and violence collide. But after years of grief and fighting, justice would speak its final word. Before I tell you what happened, comment your country and time below. Bianca Michelle Devins lived in two worlds simultaneously, though perhaps that's true of all young people born into the digital age. In one world, she was a teenager navigating the familiar rhythms of small city life in Utica, New York, a place where everyone seemed to know someone who knew your family, where winters were brutal and summers humid, with a Mohawk River wound through neighborhoods like a memory you couldn't quite shake. In the other world, the one that existed in pixels and light, in carefully composed photographs and late-night conversations with strangers across time zones, she was Bianca, or Bianca _ or any number of usernames she cycled through on Instagram, Discord, and other platforms where young people congregated to share art, music, memes, and pieces of their interior lives. She was 17 in the summer of 2019. Just 17. An age when everything feels simultaneously urgent and eternal. When you're caught between childhood and whatever comes next. When you're building an identity like someone constructing a house with no blueprint. Those who knew her in the physical world, her mother, Kim Devins, her sister Olivia, her school friends, knew Bianca as creative, sensitive, sometimes struggling with the weight of her own thoughts. She had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, a condition that made her emotional world feel like living with the volume turned up too high on everything. Joy was euphoric. Pain was crushing. Relationships felt like lifelines. She channeled much of that intensity into art. She drew, painted, created digital collages that blended anime aesthetics with personal symbolism. Her Instagram feed was a curated gallery of self-portraits, artistic photography, and the kind of moody, introspective content that resonated with other young people searching for connection in an increasingly fractured world. Online, she had cultivated a following, not million, not even hundreds of thousands, but enough that she felt seen, enough that strangers recognized her aesthetic, enough that she received messages daily from people who found something meaningful in her work, her photos, her willingness to share both the light and dark aspects of her experience. She called herself an e-girl, a term that had emerged from internet subcultures to describe young women who embraced alternative fashion, gaming culture, and an online-first identity. It was part aesthetic, part lifestyle, part performance. For Bianca, it was also armor, a way of controlling her own image in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. But every image, every post, every shared moment was also an invitation. And not everyone who accepted that invitation came with good intention. July 13th, 2019 was a Saturday, the kind of summer evening when the heat finally breaks and the world becomes bearable again. In Queens, New York, hundreds of young people were gathering for a concert, one of those events that gets promoted primarily through social media, where the crowd is as much about being seen as seeing performance. Bianca had made plans to attend with Brandon Andrew Clark. He was 21 years old, a community college student who had inserted himself into Bianca's life with the persistence of someone who couldn't distinguish between interest and obsession. They had met online months earlier through mutual friends and Discord servers, those digital gathering spaces where people bonded over shared interests in music, games, and internet culture. What began as casual conversation had evolved into something more complicated. Brandon called Bianca his girlfriend. She called him a friend. The distinction mattered, though Brandon seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge it. He had become a fixture in her online world, commenting on her posts, appearing in her Discord chats, offering rides when she needed transportation. To Bianca's mother, Kim, Brandon had seemed harmless at first, awkward perhaps, too eager, but not dangerous. Just another young person caught in the confusing terrain of modern relationship, where the boundaries between friendship, romantic interest, and something else entirely could blur beyond recognition. The concert was supposed to be fun, an escape from Utica, a chance to be part of something larger. They drove down together in Brandon's car, arriving as the sun began its long summer descent toward the horizon. The venue pulsed with bass and body. Lights strobed across faces, painted with glitter and defiant. For a few hours, Bianca was exactly where she wanted to be, anonymous in the crowd, free from the weight of everything else. But sometime during the evening, something shifted. Witnesses later reported seeing Brandon and Bianca arguing. His body language grew tense, possessive. She pulled away, laughing with other people, taking photos, existing in a space that didn't center him. Each moment of her independence seemed to wound him in some fundamental way, as though her attention was something he owned and she was violating an unspoken contract. When the concert ended and the crowd dispersed into the humid night, they got back into his car for the 2.5-hour drive back to Utica. It was after midnight. The highway stretched ahead of them, mostly empty, lit by the occasional passing truck and the ambient glow of distant city. What they talked about during that drive, we can only imagine what arguments unfolded in the darkness of that car, what promises were made or boundaries declared, what delusional narrative was hardening in Brandon's mind as the miles disappeared beneath the tire. They arrived back in Utica around 3 in the morning on July 14th, a Sunday that was just beginning, though for most of the city, it was still Saturday night extending into the dark hours before dawn. Brandon didn't take Bianca home. Instead, he drove to a dead-end street in a quiet neighborhood, pulling onto Poe Street near some wooded areas and train tracks. The kind of place teenagers sometimes want to have conversations they didn't want parents overhearing, where the city gave way to shadows and privacy. The details of what happened next are difficult to narrate, not because they're unknown, but because their brutality sits in such stark contrast to the ordinariness of the setting. A summer night, a parked car, the chirping of crickets in the grass. At some point, an argument escalated. At some point, Brandon's obsession curdled into rage. At some point, he produced a knife. Bianca fought. Evidence would later show that she fought hard, desperately, instinctively trying to preserve the life that still stretched before her with all its unrealized possibility. But she was 17 and small, and he was driven by something that had long ago stopped resembling love or even coherent thought. When it was over, when Bianca Michelle Devins lay dead in that car beneath the indifferent summer stars, Brandon did something that would distinguish this tragedy from countless others. He took photographs. Then, methodically, deliberately, he began posting them online. Dawn broke over Utica on July 14th. In shades of rose and gold. Early morning joggers started their route. Church bells would soon call the faithful to Sunday services. Parents made coffee and scrolled through their phone, expecting nothing more disturbing than political arguments or celebrity gossip. Instead, an image began spreading across Discord servers, for Chan boards, Instagram feed, a photograph so horrific that those who saw it couldn't quite process what they were looking at. Some initially dismissed it as fake, another piece of dark internet humor taken too far. Others recognized Bianca immediately. Brandon had posted the images to Bianca's own Discord server first, among the community of friends and followers who knew her, who had chatted with her, who thought of her as someone they had a relationship with. Then he posted them more widely, to platforms where anonymity and nihilism created spaces for the worst of human nature to flourish. With the images came a confession of sorts, fragmented messages about how she was the only person I ever loved and how, "I'm sorry, Bianca." But the apology, if it could even be called that, came after he had violated her one final, unforgivable time. It wasn't enough that he had taken her life. He had to take her image, her dignity, her memory, and scatter them across the internet like ashes. By mid-morning, emergency services received calls. Witnesses had seen a man lying in the road on Post Street, apparently having harmed himself. When police arrived, they found Brandon Clark alive, having made a half-hearted attempt at suicide with a knife. He was injured but conscious, theatrical in his distress. They found Bianca in the car. The coroner would later determine she had suffered more than 24 wounds to her neck and throat. The violence had been frenzied, personal, excessive. This wasn't a murder that sought efficiency. It was rage given physical form, a tantrum thrown by someone who couldn't accept that Bianca belonged to herself. In traditional true crime narratives, cases go cold when leads dry up, when witnesses fall silent, when evidence languishes in boxes, while years pass and memories fade. Bianca's case was solved within hours. Brandon Clark was arrested at the scene. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, captured in his own photographs and posts. But in another sense, the case didn't go cold at all. It became a burning ember that wouldn't extinguish, a wound that wouldn't heal, because the violation continued. The images Brandon had posted began their own terrible journey across the internet. They were shared, reshared, downloaded, archived, weaponized. People who had never heard of Bianca Devins before July 14th became collectors of her death, spreading the photographs to shock, to hurt, to participate in some dark ritual of online cruelty. In the weeks that followed, Bianca's family would search her name online and find images waiting for them on Instagram, Twitter, Discord, forums she had never visited, in countries she had never seen. The algorithms that had once amplified her art now amplified her death, treating murder photos as just another form of content to be optimized and distributed. This was a new kind of cold case, not unsolved, but unresolved. Justice could be served in a courtroom. But how do you get justice against the internet itself? Kim Devins learned her daughter was dead from the internet, not from a police officer at her door, not from a phone call delivered with practical compassion, but from images spreading across social media platforms like a virus for which there was no vaccine. The same technology that had allowed her to watch Bianca grow up, to see her daughter's creativity reach strangers across the world, now forced her to confront her murder in the most public, most violating way imaginable. There is a particular cruelty in this that defies easy articulation. Grief is supposed to be private, even when it's shared. Death is supposed to have rituals, boundaries, spaces where the living can process loss without an audience. But the internet recognizes no such boundary. It had taken the worst moment of the Devins family's life and turned it into content. In the days after July 14th, the Devins home in Utica became a strange kind of fortress. They unplugged, logged off, tried to create buffer zones between themselves and the digital nightmare unfolding in their daughter's name. But the world kept intruding. Well-meaning neighbors wanted to offer condolences. Media outlets wanted statements. Online strangers wanted to know what Bianca was really like, as though their curiosity entitled them to pieces of her. Olivia, Bianca's older sister, found herself in an impossible position. She wanted to defend her sister's memory, to push back against the narratives emerging online that blamed Bianca for her own death, suggestions that she had been too provocative, too trusting, too present on social media. But every time she searched for her sister's name to see what was being said, she risked encountering the photographs again. The images became a kind of ghost that haunted every digital space. Instagram would remove them when reported, only for them to reappear hours later uploaded by new accounts. Twitter suspended users who shared them, but the suspensions were temporary, and the photos lived on in archives and private groups. Discord servers were shut down, but new ones spawned immediately in their place. In the weeks that turned to months after Bianca's death, Kim Devins found herself returning to the same questions that millions of parents ask after unspeakable loss. What did I miss? What could I have done different? Was there a moment where intervention was still possible, where the trajectory could have been altered, where her daughter would still be alive? She had known about Brandon, had met him, even. He had seemed odd, certainly, too intense, too eager to be involved in Bianca's life. But odd isn't dangerous. Awkward isn't violent. How was she supposed to know that beneath his awkwardness lay something malignant, something that would eventually demand Bianca's death as payment for the crime of existing independently? The trial wouldn't happen for months, maybe longer. Legal processes move at their own glacial pace, grinding through motions and filings and procedural requirements, while family existed in a state of suspended animation. Brandon was in custody, that much was certain. But custody wasn't justice. Custody was just waiting. And while they waited, life went on around them in ways that felt almost offensive. The seasons changed. Summer gave way to autumn, leaves turning gold and red over Utica, like the world was oblivious to what had been lost. Halloween came, and Thanksgiving, and then Christmas. Holidays that Bianca would never experience again. Empty places at tables, gifts that would never be given, futures that dissolved like smoke. Kim kept Bianca's room exactly as she'd left it. The art on the walls, the clothes hanging in the closet, the technology she'd used to build her online presence. It was part shrine, part crime scene, part museum to a life cut short. Sometimes Kim would sit in there for hours, trying to feel close to her daughter, try to understand what Bianca had experienced in those final moments. The psychologist would later have terms for this: complicated grief, prolonged grief disorder, traumatic bereavement. But labels didn't change the reality. Bianca was gone, and the manner of her going made it impossible to find peace. Utica, New York, is a small city with a complicated history. Once a manufacturing hub along the Erie Canal, it had experienced the same post-industrial decline as many Rust Belt communities. Factories closing, young people leaving, neighborhoods slowly eroding. By 2019, it was rebuilding, reinventing itself, trying to figure out what comes after the industries that defined a place disappear. Bianca's murder became a defining moment for the city in ways no one wanted. National media descended on Utica, interviewing anyone who would talk, filming B-roll of streets and buildings as though the geography itself could explain what had happened. Think pieces proliferated online about internet culture, about violence against women, about the dangers of social media, about mental illness, about obsession. Many of these pieces were thoughtful, genuinely trying to grapple with difficult questions. Others were exploitative, using Bianca's death as a hook for whatever agenda the writer wanted to advance. Her image, not the murder photos, but the selfies and art photos she had posted while alive, circulated endlessly, often without context, divorced from the person she had actually been. In Utica itself, the response was more immediate and personal. Vigils were held. Candles were lit. Teenagers who had known Bianca from school or online gathered to share memories and cry together. Local artists created murals in her honor, transforming walls into memorials that declared her life had mattered, that she was more than her death. But as weeks became months, the public attention faded. Media moved on to other tragedies. The national conversation shifted. People who had changed their profile pictures to honor Bianca changed them back to photos of themselves. The vigils stopped. The flowers left at memorial sites wilted and were cleared away by maintenance workers. This is the natural rhythm of public grief. We cannot sustain intensity indefinitely. Life demands that we move forward, even from the unthinkable. But for the DEVINS family, there was no moving forward. There was only the daily reality of absence and the ongoing battle against the images that continued to spread. While waiting for Brandon Clark's trial, the DEVINS family found themselves fighting another battle entirely, one against tech company, against platform policy, against the fundamental architecture of the internet itself. Every major social media platform has terms of service that prohibit graphic violence and glorification of violence, but terms of service and enforcement are two different things. The platforms rely on a combination of automated systems and human moderators to police billions of pieces of content uploaded daily. The scale is almost incomprehensible. Bianca's murder photos kept slipping through these systems. Sometimes they were masked slightly, cropped, filtered, embedded in memes, in ways that fooled automated detection. Sometimes they were reported and still not removed, human moderators making judgment calls under time pressure with limited context. Sometimes they were removed from one platform only to flourish on another. Kim Devins became a reluctant activist. She learned the language of platform moderation. She studied algorithms and reporting systems. She made contact with executives at Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. She became one of thousands of people worldwide fighting to control their own family's images in a digital ecosystem that seems designed to make such control impossible. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act protects platforms from liability for user-generated content. It's a legal foundation that allows social media to exist in its current form. Platforms aren't publishers. They're just intermediaries, and they can't be held responsible for what users post. But that protection creates a paradox. Platforms have the power to remove content, but limited legal obligation to do so. They create systems that prioritize engagement, that amplify emotional content because emotional content keeps users scrolling, and then express surprise when those systems spread violence and trauma. The Devins family's fight against this system was, in many ways, more frustrating than the criminal case against Brandon. At least with Brandon, there was a clear defendant, a clear set of charges, a clear path toward resolution. Against the platforms, against the internet, what recourse existed? They could report individual instances of the photo. They could make public statements, pleading with people not to share them. They could lobby for policy change. But the photos remained, scattered across the web like landmines, waiting for family members to stumble across them. The legal system moves slowly, but between arrest and trial, time takes on a different quality. Each day feels simultaneously endless and wasted. Progress happens in increments measured in court filings and hearing dates. Lawyers use phrases like building the case and due process, while families wait for something that resembles closure. For the Devins family, this waiting was compounded by the nature of the crime itself. Brandon Clark's guilt was never in question. He had been caught at the scene. He had documented his own action. There was no mystery to solve, no alternative theory to investigate. The only questions were procedural. What charges exactly would be filed? Would he plead guilty or go to trial? What would the sentencing be? How would the court balance mental health considerations against the brutality of the crime? These questions, while important, felt insufficient to the enormity of the loss. Bianca had been 17. She had been on the cusp of everything: college, career, adult relationships, the chance to see who she might become. All of that was erased in a parked car on a summer night by someone who claimed to love her. Kim started a foundation in Bianca's name, focused on internet safety and combating image-based abuse. It gave the grief a channel, a purpose, a way to transform pain into something that might protect others. But it couldn't fill the absence. Birthdays passed. Bianca would have turned 18, then 19. The family marked these occasions privately, trying to honor her memory, without reopening the wounds that never fully healed. And then, after months of waiting, word came. Brandon Clark was ready to enter a plea. This was not Technically, a cold case requiring reinvestigation. The evidence was overwhelming from the beginning. But in another sense, every unanswered question about why, about what drove Brandon Clark to do what he did, represented its own kind of unsolved mystery. When Brandon's legal team announced he would be entering a guilty plea to second-degree murder, it represented both closure and the absence of closure. There would be no trial, no public examination of evidence, no opportunity for Bianca's family to hear testimony or cross-examine the person who had destroyed their lives. In the American legal system, plea deals are common. They save time, money, and the uncertainty of jury trials. But they also mean certain questions never get asked in open court. Certain truths never get documented in official transcripts. The DEVINS family was informed before the plea became public. Prosecutors walked them through what it meant. Brandon would admit to murdering Bianca. In exchange for his plea, he would face 25 years to life in prison rather than risk a longer sentence at trial. The deal was, in the cold calculus of the legal system, reasonable. But reasonable doesn't mean satisfying. Though there would be no trial, the evidence that had been gathered painted a comprehensive picture of the hours leading up to Bianca's death. Digital forensics had extracted data from Brandon's phone, revealing a pattern of messages in the days before July 14th that showed his emotional state deteriorating. He had been sending increasingly possessive messages to Bianca, angry that she was talking to other people online, convinced that she belonged to him despite her repeated assertions that they were just friends. On the night of the concert, he had documented his own jealousy, taking photos of Bianca talking to others, sending messages to friends about feeling disrespected and betrayed. The language was that of someone in a relationship, but Bianca had never agreed to be in a relationship with him. His delusion had created obligations she never consented to, and her refusal to perform the role he'd assigned her had become, in his mind, a capital offense. Forensic analysis of the crime scene confirmed what the photographs had already shown. The attack had been sustained and brutal. Bianca had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, evidence that she had tried to protect herself. The medical examiner's report, sparing in its clinical language, nevertheless conveyed the horror of those final moments. But perhaps the most damning evidence was Brandon's own behavior after murder. His decision to photograph Bianca's body and share those images wasn't impulsive or accidental. He had captioned images. He had tagged them. He had chosen specific platforms and communities where he knew they would spread. Even in his supposed remorse, his supposed suicide attempt, there was calculation, a desire to control the narrative, to make his own suffering the story rather than what he had done to her. This was a revelation that emerged from the evidence. Brandon Clark hadn't killed Bianca in a moment of passion or lost control. He had killed her because she refused to be what he wanted her to be, and then he had violated her memory as a final assertion of power. Mental health evaluations of Brandon Clark were conducted as part of the legal proceedings, though the details remained largely sealed. What emerged publicly painted a picture of someone whose understanding of relationships had been warped by internet culture, isolation, and a fundamental inability to see other people as fully human. He had spent an enormous amount of time in online spaces where women were objects of either worship or hatred, where e-girls like Bianca were simultaneously pedestalized and demonized. These communities, parts of Discord, forums like 4chan and 8chan, certain corners of Reddit, cultivated a particular kind of toxic masculinity that treated male loneliness as a tragedy and female independence as a betrayal. Brandon had absorbed these ideas, letting them calcify into a worldview where Bianca's kindness became an obligation, where her attention became a commodity he owned, where her choices were violations of an unspoken contract. This was an insanity in the legal sense. Brandon knew right from wrong. He had planned the murder, even if that planning was only minutes or hours in advance. He had been competent enough to drive, to navigate social situations at the concert, to execute his plan, but it surrendered his empathy, his ability to see Bianca as a person with her own inner life, her own hopes, her own autonomy. She had become, to him, a character in a story he was writing, and when she deviated from the script, he decided the story needed to end. February 2020, a courtroom in Utica. The DEVINS family seated in the gallery, surrounded by victim advocates and flanked by prosecutors. Brandon Clark, wearing an orange jumpsuit, standing before a judge. The proceeding was brief, almost anticlimactic. Brandon entered his guilty plea to second-degree murder. The judge confirmed that he understood what he was admitting, that he understood the consequences. There was no dramatic breakdown, no emotional confession, no moment of clarity where he seemed to genuinely understand what it had taken from the world. He answered the judge's questions in a flat voice. Yes, he understood. Yes, he was pleading guilty. Yes, he had killed Bianca Devins on July 14th, 2019, for the Devins family. Hearing him say it aloud brought no relief. They had never doubted his guilt. But there was something in the formality of the moment, in the state's recognition of what had been done, That marked a boundary. This part was over. Now came sentencing. Victim impact statements would be read. The family would have the opportunity to speak. And Brandon Clark would learn exactly how many years he would spend behind bars for deciding that if he couldn't control Bianca's life, he would end it. Sentencing hearings are supposed to be about justice, but often they're about catharsis, the one moment when victims and their families get to speak directly to the person who harmed them to make their pain visible in a way that transcends police reports and legal filing. The DEVINS family had prepared for this moment for months. They had written and rewritten their victim impact statement, trying to find language adequate to the enormity of the loss. How do you explain what it means to lose a daughter, a sister, a person whose future was stolen? How do you make someone understand who has demonstrated their fundamental inability to understand? Kim Devin spoke first. Her voice was steady, though tears ran down her face. She talked about Bianca as a child, about her creativity and kindness, about the dreams she had shared for her future. She talked about what it meant to watch your child grow up, to see them become themselves, and then to have that process violently terminated. She talked about the ongoing trauma of the images, how every day she lived in fear of seeing them again, of Bianca's death being used for entertainment or shock value by strangers who had never known her in life. "You didn't just kill my daughter," she said, looking directly at Brandon. "You tried to kill her memory. You tried to turn her into something horrible. But Bianca was beautiful and creative and loved, and that's what we will remember." Olivia spoke next, her voice breaking as she described what it meant to lose her sister. She talked about the phone calls they would never have, the advice Bianca would never give, the aunt she would never become to Olivia's future children. She talked about scrolling through old text messages and photos, trying to keep Bianca's voice alive in her memory, even as time inevitably dulled the edges. Friends spoke. Teachers spoke. Each testimony added another layer to the portrait of who Bianca had been, pushing back against the reductive narratives that had circulated online, that she was just an e-girl, just a victim, just a cautionary tale. When it was Brandon Clark's turn to speak, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Would he show remorse? Would he offer explanation? Would he finally demonstrate some understanding of what he had done? He read from a prepared statement. His voice was quiet, almost monotone. He said he was sorry. He said he wished he could take it back. He used the passive constructions of someone describing an accident rather than a choice. It happened. Things went wrong. I lost control. He talked about his own pain, his own mental health struggle, his own loneliness. There was a studied quality to his remorse, as though he had learned what was expected in such moment and was performing the appropriate emotions rather than feeling them. He never said Bianca's name. The prosecutor pointed this out in her response. The defendant has had months to think about what to say today. He's had months to reflect on his actions, and yet even now, he cannot bring himself to name the person he killed. Bianca Devin. Her name was Bianca Devin, and she deserved to live. The judge in the case had reviewed everything, the evidence, the psychological evaluations, the victim impact statements, the defendant's history. He had to balance the legal requirements of second-degree murder sentencing with the specific circumstances of this case. When he spoke, his words were measured but firm. He acknowledged that Brandon Clark had mental health issues, that he was young, that he would spend his prime years incarcerated. But he also emphasized the brutality of the crime, the violation of sharing the images, the ongoing harm to Bianca's family. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. The judge said, "This was a sustained attack on a person who trusted you, and after taking her life, you attempted to take her dignity. You turned her death into a spectacle. The harm you caused extends far beyond the immediate crime." The sentence, 25 years to life. Brandon Clark would be eligible for parole after 25 years, when he would be in his late 40s. But eligibility didn't guarantee release. He would have to demonstrate rehabilitation, remorse, understanding of his crime. The parole board would review the nature of the offense, the circumstances, whether he still posed a danger. For the Devins family, the sentence was both sufficient and insufficient. No amount of prison time would bring Bianca back. No punishment would undo the trauma. But at least Brandon would be held accountable. At least the state had recognized the gravity of what he had done. In the days after sentencing, media coverage peaked one last time. Articles were written analyzing the case's implications for internet safety, for stalking laws, for how we think about online relationship. Bianca's story became a touchstone in larger conversations about technology and violence. Some of this coverage was thoughtful and necessary. Some of it was exploitative, using Bianca's name for clicks while adding little to the actual discourse. The Devins family tried to stay above the fray, focusing on their foundation work rather than engaging with everything piece and hot take. But the image problem persists despite platform policies, despite increased awareness, despite the family's efforts. Bianca's murder photos continued to circulate. They became in the darkest corners of the internet, a kind of currency shared to shock new users, posted to memorial pages by trolls seeking to cause pain, archived in spaces where violence and misogyny flourished. Instagram eventually implemented new systems specifically designed to catch and remove the images faster. They created a database of the photo's digital fingerprints and used machine learning to identify variation. Other platforms followed suit, but the game of whack-a-mole continued. The DEVINS family continued their advocacy work. They pushed for legislation that would make it easier for families to have violent images of their loved ones removed from the internet. They spoke at conferences about online safety. They worked with other families who had experienced similar violations. Kim Devins became, in a way she never wanted, an expert on the intersection of violence and social media. She testified before a legislative body. She consulted with tech companies on policy. She used her pain as fuel for change, transforming her daughter's death into a catalyst for protecting others. In Utica, Bianca's memory lived on in more personal ways. The murals remained, touched up periodically by local artists who wanted to ensure she wasn't forgotten. On July 14th each year, small vigils were held, not the massive public gatherings of the first anniversary, but intimate gatherings of people who had known her, who wanted to honor her life rather than sensationalize her death. Her high school established a scholarship in her name for students pursuing art. Local galleries displayed some of her work, giving people a chance to see her talent independent of the tragedy. These were small gestures, but they mattered. They insisted that Bianca was more than a victim, more than a cautionary tale, more than a trending topic. Online, communities that had known Bianca created private spaces to share memories and support each other. They were careful with what they posted publicly, wary of attracting the kind of morbid curiosity that had plagued Bianca's memory. But privately, they kept her alive through stories and shared grief. Some of her online friends, teenagers themselves when she died, now aging into young adults, carried her memory into their own work. They became advocates for internet safety. They created art inspired by her. They made different choices about what to share online, who to trust, how to protect themselves in digital spaces that could be both creative and dangerous. Bianca Devins' murder forced uncomfortable questions that society is still struggling to answer. What is the responsibility of social media platforms when their systems are used to spread images of violence? Is Section 230 protection absolute, or should platforms face consequences for failing to remove harmful content quickly? How do we teach young people to navigate online relationships when the lines between friendship, romance, and obsession can blur so easily? When parasocial relationship, the one-sided bonds people form with online personality, can metastasize into stalking and violence? What do we do about the communities where misogyny and violence are normalized, where young men radicalize each other into believing they're owed women's attention, affection, and body? How do we intervene before resentment becomes rage, becomes murder? These questions don't have easy answers. They require examining the fundamental architecture of how we've built our digital world, the incentives that prioritize engagement over safety, the algorithms that amplify outrage, the anonymity that shields bad actors from consequence. They also require examining cultural narratives about gender, relationships, and control. Brandon Clark didn't invent the idea that women who reject men deserve punishment. He absorbed it from centuries of cultural messaging, refined and intensified in online spaces where those ideas could flourish without challenge. Bianca's case became a catalyst for legislative efforts in several states. Bianca's law was proposed in New York, aimed at requiring social media companies to provide better mechanisms for families to have violent images removed. The law faced challenges, questions about free speech, about the practicality of enforcement, about whether legislation could keep pace with technological change. But the conversation itself mattered. For the first time, lawmakers were grappling seriously with the question of what happens when our digital infrastructure becomes a vector for ongoing harm, when murder doesn't end at death, but extends into an eternal digital afterlife. In prison, Brandon Clark became just another inmate serving time for murder. He was housed in a medium security facility in upstate New York, far from the spotlight that had briefly made him infamous. According to limited report, he kept largely to himself. He wasn't the type to cause trouble, to join gang, to become a disciplinary problem. He was, by most accounts, quiet, compliant, unremarkable. He took classes. He worked prison jobs. He attended counseling sessions. Whether any of this represented genuine rehabilitation or simply going through the motion, playing a game of prison life until parole eligibility, was impossible to say. Some who study violent offenders suggest that men like Brandon, who kill out of possessiveness rather than psychopathy, whose violence is intimately directed rather than random, can potentially change. With intensive therapy, with time away from the toxic influences that shape their thinking, with enough consequences to force genuine reflection, transformation is theoretically possible. Others are more skeptical. They point out that Brandon's final act of violation, posting the images, wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, designed to extend his control beyond death itself. That level of cruelty, they argue, suggests something fundamental is broken in ways that may not be fixable. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Brandon Clark is human, which means he contains a capacity for change. But whether he chooses that capacity, whether he ever genuinely understands what he took from the world, remains to be seen. In 2044, when he becomes eligible for parole, he will have to face a board and explain why he deserves release. He will have to articulate understanding of his crime, demonstrate remorse, convince skeptical officials that he no longer poses a threat. The DEVINS family has already stated they will oppose his parole every time he's eligible, for as long as it takes. They will be there at those hearings, ready to remind the board of who Bianca was and what was taken from her. 5 years after Bianca's death, Kim Devins sat for an interview with a journalist, writing a retrospective on the case. She looked tired, older than her years, but there was steel in her voice when she talked about her daughter. "People ask me if I have closure," she said, "and I don't know what that word even means anymore. Bianca is gone. That will never change. Brandon is in prison, but that doesn't bring her back. The images are still out there, and I'm still fighting to have them removed. So no, I don't have closure. What I have is purpose." The foundation she started in Bianca's name had grown. They had helped other families navigate the aftermath of image-based violence. They had consulted with platforms on content moderation. They had pushed for legislative changes in multiple states. The work was endless and often frustrating, but it was also meaningful. Bianca was so creative, Kim continued. She had so much she wanted to do with her life. She wanted to be an artist, to create things that matter to people. And in a way, that's what we're trying to do now. We're trying to create something good out of this horror. It's not what she would have chosen, but it's what we can do to honor her. The journalist asked about forgiveness, whether Kim had forgiven Brandon, whether she thought forgiveness was even possible in a case like this. Kim was quiet for a long moment. "Forgiveness isn't for him," she finally said. "It's not about letting him off the hook or saying what he did was okay. If I forgive him someday, it will be because I need to release the anger that's poisoning me. But I'm not there yet. Maybe I'll never be there. And that's okay too." Bianca's case changed how many people thought about online safety, but the changes were subtle and incomplete. Some teenagers became more cautious about what they shared online, more aware of the potential for obsessive behavior from followers and friends. Parents had more conversations with their children about boundaries and red flags, but the fundamental dynamics that made Bianca's murder possible remained largely unchanged. Social media platforms continued to prioritize growth and engagement. Online communities where misogyny flourished continued to exist. Young people continued to build relationships in digital spaces where the normal social cues and safety mechanisms of physical interaction didn't apply. There were small victories. Some platforms improved their image hashing technology, making it harder for violent images to spread. Some states passed legislation, giving families more tools to combat digital harassment. Some schools implemented better education programs about healthy relationships and online safety. But these were incremental changes in a vast ecosystem. The internet that made Bianca's art and self-expression possible was the same internet that enabled her murder to become a spectacle. That duality, the internet as both creative tool and vector for violence, remained unresolved. Bianca's case gained attention partly because of its brutality, partly because of the digital violation, but also partly because of who she was, a young, photogenic white woman whose story fits certain media narrative. But she wasn't the only victim of obsessive violence, of men who couldn't accept rejection, of relationships that turned lethal. In the years before and after her death, countless other women, disproportionately women of color, trans women, women working in marginalized industry, were killed by intimate partners or obsessive acquaintances. Their stories didn't always make national news. Their cases didn't always spark legislative action. The Devins family tried to be conscious of this reality in their advocacy work. They partnered with organizations that focused on domestic violence and intimate partner homicide more broadly. They tried to use the attention Bianca's case received to shine light on the larger epidemic of gender-based violence. Because Bianca's story, while unique in its detail, was also tragically common in its theme. A man who believed he was entitled to a woman's attention. A woman who said no. Violence as a response to that rejection. And a society that often looks for ways to blame the victim rather than examine the cultural forces that produce violent men. What does it mean to have a legacy when you're 17? When you didn't live long enough to achieve the things you dreamed of, to become the person you might have been? Bianca's legacy is complicated. She's remembered as a victim, which is true but reductive. She's remembered as an artist, though her work was just beginning to develop. She's remembered as a cautionary tale about internet danger, though she wasn't doing anything millions of young people don't do every day. Perhaps the truest legacy is the one her family is building, the foundation that bears her name, the advocacy work that uses her story to protect others, the insistence that her life matter beyond the manner of her death. Her art remains online, archived carefully by friends and family in spaces protected from trolls and violence seekers. Looking at her work now, knowing what happened, there's a temptation to read tragedy into every image, to search for signs of what was coming. But that's not fair to who she was in life. Bianca was a teenager exploring her creativity, building an identity, figuring out who she wanted to be. She was flawed and talented, sensitive and strong, struggling and hopeful. She was, in other words, human, fully, beautifully, messily human. That humanity is what Brandon Clark tried to erase, first with knife and then with photograph. But it's also what persists in the memories of those who loved her, in the work being done in her name, in the conversations her death has forced us to have. Is 25 years to life justice for taking someone's life? For taking not just their life, but their dignity? For causing ongoing trauma to their family? For contributing to a culture where violence against women is documented and distributed as entertainment? There are arguments on multiple sides. Some believe Brandon Clark got off too lightly, that second-degree murder didn't adequately capture premeditation and cruelty involved. They argue he should have been charged with first-degree murder, that he should never have the possibility of parole. Others point out that 25 years is a significant portion of a human life, that he was 21 when he committed the crime, that he'll be middle-aged before he even has a chance at release. They argue that the purpose of justice should be rehabilitation, not merely punishment. Still others suggest that focusing on Brandon Clark's sentence misses a larger point, that individual punishment doesn't address the systemic issues that produce the crime, that until we confront toxic masculinity, online radicalization, and the platforms that enable both, there will be other Brandons and other Biancas. All of these perspectives contain truth. Justice is not a simple equation where you balance harm against punishment and arrive at a clean answer. It's messy and incomplete, and it rarely gives anyone the peace they're seeking. For the Devins family, justice was Brandon Clark in prison, unable to hurt anyone else. But it was also Instagram finally taking their concerns seriously. It was New York lawmakers considering legislation in Bianca's name. It was other young people learning from her story and making safer choices. Justice was imperfect and ongoing, a process rather than an outcome, something they would have to keep fighting for long after the news cameras moved on. In the years after Bianca's death, her case was discussed in psychology classes, in criminal justice programs, in tech policy seminars. It became a reference point in larger conversations about digital culture and violence. Researchers studied the spread of the murder images, try and understand why people shared such content, what motivations drove the distribution of violence. The findings were disturbing. Some shared out of morbid curiosity, some to shock friends, some because they genuinely didn't understand the harm they were causing. Some, in the darkest corners, shared specifically to cause pain to Bianca's family and friends. Tech companies used Bianca's case in discussions about content moderation, about the challenges of scale, about the need for better tools. But discussions didn't always translate to action, and action didn't always work as intended. The problems were genuinely difficult. How do you moderate billions of pieces of content without either excessive censorship or inadequate protection? Feminist scholars analyzed the case through the lens of gender-based violence, examining how Bianca's murder fit into larger patterns of men killing women who reject them. They noted the parallels to other high-profile cases. Elliot Rodgers' killing spree in East La Vista, Alec Manassian's van attack in Toronto, where male entitlement and misogyny turned lethal. These conversations mattered, but they also felt insufficient. Bianca wasn't a case study. She wasn't a data point. She was a person, and she was gone, and no amount of analysis could change that. By 2025, 6 years after Bianca's death, the world looked different in some ways and depressingly familiar in others. Social media had evolved. New platforms had emerged. Old ones had adapted, but the fundamental dynamics remain. Young people still build identities online. Obsessive behavior still escalated into violence. Families still fought to have images of their murdered loved ones removed from the internet. The Devins family had settled into a new normal that wasn't really normal at all. They had learned to carry the grief, to function around the absent, to find meaning in advocacy even as they recognized that nothing would bring Bianca back. Kim Devins had become a recognized voice in discussions of internet safety and image-based abuse. She spoke at conferences, consulted with lawmakers, partnered with other families facing similar battles. The work was both cathartic and re-traumatizing. Every time she told Bianca's story, she had to relive the worst moments of her life. Olivia had moved forward with her own life while carrying Bianca with her. She had graduated college, started a career, tried to build a future in the shadow of her sister's absence. She talked about Bianca not as a saint or a victim, but as her sister, annoying sometimes, brilliant sometimes, complicated always. The foundation continued its work, adapting to new challenges as technology evolved. They pushed for better revenge porn laws that could also apply to violent images. They advocated for the right to be forgotten, the ability for families to demand permanent removal of certain content. They trained platform moderators on the trauma involved in family notification and content review. None of it brought Bianca back, but it gave her death meaning beyond tragedy, legacy beyond victimhood. In the end, Bianca Devins' story is about the collision of old violence and new technology, about how the ancient crime of intimate partner homicide found a new form in the digital age, extending beyond the moment of death into an eternal present where murder images circulate forever. It's a story about the double-edged nature of social media, how the same platforms that allowed a teenage artist to share her work with the world also enabled her killer to violate her one final time, about how the internet's greatest strength, its ability to connect, to share, to preserve, become its greatest dangers when weaponized. It's a story about obsession and entitlement, about young men who absorb toxic ideas about relationships in online echo chambers, who come to believe that women's attention and affection are commodities they're owed, who respond to rejection with rage. But most fundamentally, it's a story about a 17-year-old girl who deserved to live. Bianca Devins was not perfect. No teenager is. She struggled with mental health challenges, made mistakes, navigated relationships imperfectly, but she was creative and kind, talented and complicated, working to figure out who she wanted to be in a world that was both inspiring and dangerous. She created art. She connected with people across distances. She built friendships and explored her identity. She was doing what young people have always done, trying on different versions of themselves, seeking community, looking for meaning and connection. She shouldn't have died for that. And the fact that she did, that Brandon Clark decided her life belonged to him to take, is not a statement about her choices, but about his violence. This case reminds us that we have built a world where violence can extend beyond death, where trauma can be endlessly reproduced and redistributed, where families have to fight for the basic dignity of controlling their loved ones' final images. It reminds us that we have work to do in how we build technology, how we moderate content, how we teach young people about healthy relationships, how we intervene when obsession starts escalating toward violence. It reminds us that justice is imperfect and incomplete, that prison sentences don't undo harm, that legal victories don't bring back the dead. But it also reminds us that families like the Devins can take their pain and transform it into purpose, using tragedy as a catalyst for change, even as they carry grief that will never fully resolve. 6 years later, Bianca's murder photos still circulate online, but so does her art. So do the memories of people who loved her. So does the foundation bearing her name, working to protect others from similar fate. Brandon Clark is in prison, and he will be for decades. The systems that enabled him, the online communities that radicalize his thinking, the platforms that spread his final violation, remain largely unchanged, though slightly more aware, slightly more careful. And somewhere in Utica, New York, a bedroom remains exactly as Bianca left it on the morning of July 13th, 2019, when she got ready for a concert she would never return from. A shrine and a memorial, a reminder that she was real, that she lived, that her absence leaves a hole in the world that can never be filled. Justice may come late, but it never vanishes. Memory persists, love endures, and 17-year-old girls with artistic dreams deserve a world where they can pursue them without fear that kindness will be mistaken for obligation, that presence will be weaponized, that their final image will be chosen by someone who never understood them at all. Bianca Devins lived, she mattered, and she deserves to be remembered for who she was, not how she died.